the ruthless underworld of the Sullivan crime syndicate, weaknesses are buried. Genevieve, the boss's mute daughter, was his greatest vulnerability. But when she rescued a scarred, bloodied street dog everyone else wanted dead, she unknowingly brought home her fiercest protector and the ultimate weapon against a deadly, hidden betrayal. The city of Boston wept freezing rain the night Genevieve Sullivan found him. To the outside world, the Sullivan name meant legitimate shipping logistics and high-end real estate. To the police, and to those who lived in the city's sprawling, unforgiving underbelly, the Sullivans were the undisputed kings of the Irish-Italian syndicate. Arthur Sullivan, Genevieve's father, ruled this empire with an iron fist and the heart entirely devoid of mercy. He was a man who demanded perfection, loyalty, and above all, strength. Genevieve possessed none of the traits her father valued. At 22, she was a ghost, haunting the sprawling halls of the Sullivan estate. 12 years ago, she had witnessed her mother's brutal assassination in a crowded restaurant. The trauma had stolen her voice. She hadn't spoken a single word since she was 10 years old. Psychologists called it selective mutism. Her father called it a crippling liability. Because she couldn't scream, couldn't issue orders, and couldn't defend herself in a world built on verbal intimidation, Arthur treated her like a fragile glass doll. She was suffocated by round-the-clock bodyguards and kept entirely in the dark about the family business. But Genevieve saw everything. Silence had made her an exceptional observer. It was a Tuesday evening, just past midnight. Genevieve was riding in the back of a blacked-out SUV, returning from one of the tedious charity galas her father forced her to attend to maintain their public image. Driving the vehicle was Dominic Russo. Dominic wasn't just a driver, he was one of Arthur's rising stars, a lethal, fiercely intelligent enforcer who had been temporarily assigned to babysit the boss's daughter as punishment for insubordination. He was brooding, sharp-jawed, and carried a heavy silence of his own. As they drove past the desolate warehouse district near the docks, the headlights swept over a dark alleyway. Genevieve slammed her hand against the partition glass, startling Dominic. She pointed frantically toward the shadows. "Miss Sullivan, I can't stop here," Dominic warned, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "It's not secure." Genevieve didn't wait. The moment the SUV slowed at a red light, she unlocked her door and bolted into the freezing rain. Cursing under his breath, Dominic threw the car into park and chased after her, his hand instinctively reaching for the firearm holstered beneath his jacket. He found her kneeling in the mud and garbage of the alleyway. Lying before her was a massive, nightmarish creature. It was a cane corso, heavily scarred, emaciated, and bleeding out. It was clear the dog had been used as a bait dog in the illegal underground fighting rings that operated on the fringes of the city. Its ears were cropped close to the skull. Its dark coat was matted with dried blood, and a deep, jagged laceration tore across its shoulder. The dog was breathing in shallow, rattling gasps. It had been left here to die. "Genevieve, step away," Dominic ordered, his voice hard. "That thing is dangerous. It's a fighting dog. It'll take your hand off." Genevieve ignored him. She stripped off her $1,000 silk shawl and gently draped it over the shivering animal. The massive dog opened one swollen golden eye. It didn't growl. It didn't snap. It just stared at the silent girl with a look of profound, broken exhaustion. Genevieve looked up at Dominic, her green eyes blazing with a fierce, unspoken command. "Help me." Dominic stared at her. In the months he had guarded her, he had never seen her show this level of defiance. Against his better judgment, against every protocol Arthur Sullivan had drilled into him, Dominic holstered his weapon. He knelt in the mud, carefully scooped the 100-pound bleeding mastiff into his arms, and carried it to the SUV. Getting the dog into the Sullivan mansion was a different war entirely. When Arthur Sullivan saw the bloodied, filthy beast lying on the marble floor of his foyer, his face turned the color of ash. Standing beside Arthur was his right-hand man, a coldly calculating consigliere named Thomas Sterling. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Get that diseased mutt out of my house, Dominic. Take it to the woods and put a bullet in its head. Dominic hesitated, his jaw tight. But before he could move, Genevieve stepped directly between her father and the dog. She stood tall, her chin raised, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She stared her father down. The message was clear: if you shoot him, you shoot me. The foyer fell into a suffocating silence. Thomas Sterling scoffed a sneer, twisting his lips. Arthur, it's a liability, a stray. It could have rabies. Let the boys dispose of it. Genevieve's eyes darted to Thomas, narrowing with sudden, intense dislike, before locking back onto her father. For a long, agonizing minute, Arthur stared at his mute, broken daughter. He saw a flicker of the iron will she had inherited from him, a spark, he thought, had died the day her mother was killed. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine," he snapped. "You want the beast? You keep it, but it stays in your wing of the house. If it bites one of my men, if it steps out of line even once, I will kill it myself. Do you understand me, Genevieve?" She gave a single, curt nod. She had won. Genevieve named the dog Titan. The recovery process was grueling. Dominic, surprisingly, became her sole ally in this endeavor. Using his underworld connections, he bypassed traditional veterinary clinics that would have reported the fighting dog, bringing in a discreet, private doctor who patched up the mob's foot soldiers. For 3 weeks, Genevieve barely left her wing of the estate. She slept on the floor beside Titan's large orthopedic bed, hand-feeding him pieces of boiled chicken, changing his bandages, and wiping the infection from his wounds. Dominic visited every evening, ostensibly to check on security, but he always brought a new toy or a bag of premium treats. In the quiet sanctuary of Genevieve's room, away from the blood and violence of the Sullivan Empire, an unspoken bond began to form. Dominic treated Genevieve differently than the rest of the family did. He didn't look at her with pity, nor did he treat her muteness as a lack of intelligence. He spoke to her normally, and she replied through expressive glances, handwritten notes on a small pad, and the gentle touch of her hand on his arm. "You know," Dominic said one evening, leaning against the doorframe as he watched Genevieve brush Titan's newly shining black coat. "He's looking at you like you're God." Genevieve smiled softly, resting her forehead against Titan's massive, blocky head. The dog let out a deep, rumbling sigh and leaned his heavy weight against her legs. Titan was fully healed, weighing a muscular 130 pounds. The scars remained, mapping a history of violence on his body, but his demeanor with Genevieve was impossibly gentle. He was her shadow. Wherever she walked, Titan followed, positioning himself firmly between her and anyone who approached. But outside of Genevieve and Dominic, Titan trusted absolutely no one. The tension in the mansion grew palpable. Arthur's men were terrified of the beast. Titan never barked, a hauntingly silent trait that mirrored his mistress. But if any of the enforcers came too close to Genevieve, a low, demonic rumble would vibrate from deep within his chest, and his golden eyes would lock onto them with predatory intent. Curiously, the dog's aggression spiked highest around Thomas Sterling. Whenever the consigliere entered the dining room, Titan would immediately place himself in front of Genevieve, the fur along his spine bristling, his lips peeling back just enough to flash thick ivory fangs. "Keep that monster on a leash, Genevieve." Thomas spat one evening during a tense family dinner, adjusting his tailored suit nervously as Titan tracked his every movement. "Arthur, I'm telling you, that animal is unhinged. It's going to maul someone." "He only growls when he senses a rat, Thomas," Dominic remarked casually from the corner of the room, taking a sip of his whiskey. The subtle insult hung heavily in the air. Thomas shot Dominic a venomous glare but said nothing. Genevieve scribbled quickly on her notepad and held it up for Thomas to see. "He is an excellent judge of character." Arthur chuckled darkly at that, but the underlying danger in the house was escalating. The Sullivan family was hemorrhaging money from their shipping ports, and rival factions were getting suspiciously bold, intercepting Arthur's shipments with impossible accuracy. Paranoia was bleeding into the walls of the estate. Arthur was convinced there was a high-level mole within his inner circle, and the stress was making him reckless. The true test of Titan's loyalty came on a moonless night in late November. A terrible storm had knocked out the estate's primary power grid. Though the backup generators immediately kicked in, there was a crucial 30-second window where the perimeter cameras and electronic locks were disabled. Genevieve was asleep, curled on her side when she was jolted awake not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent absence of Titan's warmth at the foot of her bed. The room was pitch black. Genevieve sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs. She couldn't hear anything over the howling wind outside, but then a muffled thump from the hallway. She crept toward her bedroom door, a breath catching in her throat. Slowly she eased the door open just a fraction of an inch. In the dim emergency lighting of the corridor, the terrifying scene unfolded. A man dressed entirely in tactical black, his face obscured by a ski mask, was pinned to the expensive Persian runner rug. Standing over him was Titan. The dog had a vise-like grip on the intruder's forearm, the crushing pressure keeping the man immobilized. A silenced pistol lay discarded a few feet away, knocked from the intruder's hand. The man was threshing, trying to reach a combat knife strapped to his thigh with his free hand. He pulled it free, aiming a desperate upward thrust at the dog's neck. Genevieve couldn't scream. Panic seized her throat. But she didn't need to. Titan moved with blinding speed. He released the arm, dodged the blade, and clamped his massive jaws directly over the man's shoulder, dragging him violently away from the weapon. The intruder finally let out a muffled shriek of agony. Suddenly the hallway was flooded with blinding light as the main power was restored. Doors burst open. Dominic was the first one there, weapon drawn, sprinting down the corridor in his bare feet. Arthur and half a dozen guards were right behind him. "Hold your fire!" Dominic roared, stepping in front of the trigger-happy guards. He looked at Genevieve, who was trembling in the doorway, and then at the dog holding the intruder hostage. "Titan, leave it," Dominic commanded sharply. Titan didn't release his grip immediately. He looked to Genevieve. She gave a small, trembling nod. Instantly the dog let go, retreating backward to stand firmly in front of Genevieve's legs, a low, menacing growl vibrating through the hallway. Two guards hauled the bleeding, groaning intruder to his knees. Dominic stepped forward and violently ripped the ski mask off the man's face. Gasps echoed through the corridor. It wasn't a rival gang member. It wasn't a faceless assassin. It was Paulie, one of Thomas Sterling's personal drivers and the trusted low-level associate of the family. Arthur pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of absolute fury. He looked at the silenced pistol on the floor, then at the man bleeding on his carpet, and finally at the mute daughter he had always considered a weakness. "Paulie," Arthur growled, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You were coming for my daughter." Paulie, clutching his torn shoulder, looked around wildly, his eyes wide with terror. "Boss, wait, I was just following orders." "I swear to God." "Whose orders?" Dominic demanded, pressing the barrel of his gun against Paulie's forehead. Before Paulie could speak, a shock rang out, deafening in the confined space. Paulie slumped forward, dead, everyone whipped around. Standing at the end of the hallway, smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver, was Thomas Sterling. "He was a traitor, Arthur," Thomas said smoothly, lowering his weapon. "I couldn't let him speak lies and poison this family further." The boy clearly lost his mind. The silence that followed was suffocating. Genevieve's hands gripped Titan's fur tightly. She looked at Thomas, then at Dominic. Dominic's eyes met hers, and in that split second, they both realized the terrifying truth. The dog hadn't just stopped an assassin. He had forced the real rat into the light, and the war inside the Sullivan family had just begun. The sharp scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the corridor, mingling with the copper tang of blood. Arthur Sullivan stared at the lifeless body of Paulie, his chest heaving. For a man who built an empire on ruthless calculation, Arthur's blind spot had always been his loyalty to his inner circle. Thomas Sterling had been by his side for 30 years. To Arthur, Thomas's swift execution of the intruder looked like a loyal consigliere protecting the family from a traitor's lies. But Genevieve and Dominic knew exactly what it was, a desperate cover-up. In the days following the break-in, the atmosphere inside the Sullivan estate turned utterly venomous. Thomas Sterling moved through the halls with the untouchable arrogance of a man who believed he had won. He convinced Arthur that Paulie had been working alone, manipulated by the rival Moretti faction. Worse, Thomas began to systematically isolate Genevieve. He doubled the perimeter guards, replacing Dominic's trusted men with his own loyalists, claiming the estate needed fresh eyes. "Arthur, the girl is rattled," Thomas murmured one evening in the study, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. "And Dominic, he's getting too close to her. It's clouding his judgment. Send him to the Miami port for a few months. Let things cool down." Arthur, exhausted and deeply paranoid about the hemorrhaging of his shipments, agreed. The order came down the next morning. Dominic was to leave for Florida immediately. When Dominic broke the news to Genevieve in the garden, her face went deathly pale. Titan, sensing her distress, whined softly and pressed his massive head against her thigh. Genevieve grabbed her notepad, her hand shaking as she wrote, "You can't leave. He will kill me." Dominic reached out, gently taking the notepad from her trembling hands. He looked into her terrified green eyes, the hardened exterior of the Mafia enforcer melting away completely. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered fiercely, his thumb brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "I'm getting you out of here, but first we are going to tear Sterling's life apart. I just need proof." Genevieve's eyes widened. She tapped her pen against her chin, thinking rapidly. Then she began to draw a crude map. It wasn't a map of the estate. It was the layout of Thomas' private office at Sterling O'Reilly Logistics, over in the Seaport District. "He keeps a second ledger," she wrote quickly. "Black leather, kept in the floor safe beneath his mahogany desk. I saw him open it once when I was a child. He thought I wasn't paying attention." Dominic's jaw tightened. "If I go into that office, I trigger every alarm in the building. It has biometric locks." Genevieve shook her head, writing again, "Tomorrow is the annual St. Jude's Charity Gala at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. My father is forcing Thomas to attend for optics. The building will be empty. I know the override code. I watched him type it. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only play." The following night, while Arthur and Thomas were photographed sipping champagne with Boston's elite at the Fairmont, Dominic and Genevieve slipped out of the estate through the old servant tunnels. Titan was right on their heels, moving through the shadows with the silent, predatory grace of a panther. They breached the logistics building just past midnight. The silence of the empty corporate office was deafening. Following Genevieve's lead, they bypassed the primary security feeds. Dominic held his breath as Genevieve typed a 12-digit sequence into the keypad outside Thomas' suite. The light flashed green. Inside the opulent office, Genevieve dropped to her knees behind the desk, pulling back the Persian rug to reveal the floor safe. She closed her eyes, remembering a moment from over a decade ago, and spun the dial. Click. Dominic pulled the heavy door open. Inside sat stacks of cash, a velvet box containing illegal bearer bonds, and at the very bottom a black leather ledger. Dominic flipped through the pages, pulling a small flashlight from his jacket. His blood ran cold. The ledger detailed years of embezzlement, precise coordinates of Sullivan shipments sold to the Morettis, and offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. But it was a folded piece of paper tucked into the back cover that made Dominic stop breathing. It was a bank transfer receipt. The date was exactly 12 years ago. The memo line simply read, "The Capitol Grill on Newbury Street." Genevieve let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She collapsed backward onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. The Capitol Grill on Newbury Street. That was the restaurant where her mother had been gunned down. Thomas hadn't just been stealing money. He had orchestrated the assassination of the boss's wife because she had been pushing Arthur to take the family legitimate, threatening Thomas's illegal revenue streams. And Genevieve, the silent ghost, had been carrying the trauma of his betrayal her entire life. "We have him," Dominic whispered, pulling Genevieve into a tight embrace. "We have everything we need to end him." But as they turned to leave, Titan let out a deep, earth-shaking snarl, the fur on his back standing straight up. He planted himself squarely in the doorway of the office, his teeth bared in a vicious grimace. From the darkened hallway, the slow, rhythmic sound of clapping echoed into the room. Thomas Sterling stepped into the doorway, flanked by 4 heavily armed men. He hadn't gone to the gala. It had all been a trap. "I have to admit, I underestimated you, Genevieve," Thomas sneered, his eyes flicking to the ledger in Dominic's hand. "I thought you were just a broken little mute. But you've been a thorn in my side for 12 years. Dominic stepped in front of Genevieve, shielding her with his body, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. But they were outgunned, 4-1. "Hand over the book, Dominic," Thomas ordered, pulling a sleek silver pistol from his coat. "And maybe I'll make it quick. You can die a hero defending the boss's useless daughter." "Arthur will find out," Dominic growled, his muscles tensed, ready to draw. "You leave a trail of bodies, and even a blind man will see the blood on your hands." Thomas laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Arthur will see exactly what I want him to see. He will see that the rogue enforcer, Dominic Russo, kidnapped his daughter to extort the family, and I heroically tried to stop you. It's a tragic story, really." Thomas raised his gun, aiming directly at Dominic's chest. "Kill them," he commanded his men. Time seemed to fracture. Dominic drew his weapon, firing a shot that caught the nearest guard in the shoulder, but the other 3 raised their assault rifles. In that split second, the psychological dam inside Genevieve's mind built from 12 years of terror, silence, and grief violently broke. She wasn't going to watch another person she loved die. "No!" The scream tore from Genevieve's throat, raw, deafening, and absolute. It was the first word she had spoken in over a decade, and it hit the room like a physical shockwave. The unexpected sound made Thomas and his men flinch, hesitating for a fraction of a second. That fraction of a second was all Titan needed. The massive Cane Corso launched himself through the air, 130 pounds of pure, primal fury. He bypassed the guards entirely, locking his golden eyes onto the man who threatened his savior. Thomas fired, the bullet grazing Titan's ribs, spraying blood across the mahogany desk. But the pain didn't even slow the beast down. Titan slammed into Thomas's chest with the force of a freight train, driving the consigliere violently to the floor. The silver pistol skittered across the room. Chaos erupted. Dominic used the distraction to take down 2 of the guards with precise lethal shots. The 4th guard panicked, dropping his weapon and sprinting down the hallway, only to run face first into the barrels of 3 shotguns. The lights in the hallway snapped on. Standing there, flanked by his most trusted old guard enforcers, was Arthur Sullivan. "Stand down." Sir Arthur roared, his voice shaking the glass partitions of the office. The room froze. Dominic lowered his weapon, kicking the guards' rifles away. On the floor, Thomas was screaming, pinning his arms over his face as Titan stood directly over him. The dog's massive jaws clamped inches from his throat, waiting for a command. Arthur walked slowly into the room, his eyes scanning the blood, the bodies, and finally resting on his daughter. Genevieve was shaking violently, clutching Dominic's arm. "What the hell is going on here?" Arthur demanded, looking at Thomas on the floor. Genevieve let go of Dominic. She stepped forward, ignoring the blood on the carpet. She looked her father dead in the eye, her chest heaving. She pointed a trembling finger at Thomas Sterling. Genevieve's voice cracked, raspy and completely unfamiliar from years of disuse. He killed her. He killed Mom. Arthur froze. The color drained completely from his face. He looked at Dominic, who silently handed him the black ledger, open to the page with the receipt from the Capitol Grill. Arthur stared at the paper. The realization of a 12-year betrayal crashed into him. He had trusted the snake that murdered his wife, and in doing so, he had alienated the only pure thing left in his life. Arthur slowly drew his own revolver. He looked at the dog. "Call him off," Arthur whispered, his voice dead and hollow. Genevieve looked at Titan. "Titan, come." Her voice was soft, but the dog obeyed instantly. Titan released his dominant stance over Thomas, limping slightly from the grazing bullet wound, and returned to Genevieve's side, pressing his bloodied coat against her leg. Thomas scrambled backward against the wall, his face pale with terror. "Arthur, please. We built this together." "You can't believe them." Arthur didn't say a word. He raised his gun and fired once. The reign of Thomas Sterling was over. The aftermath of that night dismantled the Sullivan syndicate from the inside out. Overcome with grief and guilt, Arthur stepped down as the head of the family. He retired to a quiet estate in upstate New York, spending his remaining years trying to make amends for the blindness that had cost his family so dearly. The underground empire didn't crumble. It evolved. Genevieve never returned to the shadows. She reclaimed her voice not just in speech but in power. Alongside Dominic, she took over the legitimate branches of the Sullivan enterprise, the shipping logistics, and the real estate, ruthlessly cutting ties with the underworld elements and turning the family name into a fully legal, untouchable corporate powerhouse in Boston. Dominic and Genevieve were married 2 years later in a private, heavily guarded ceremony overlooking the harbor. It was a quiet affair, attended only by those they trusted implicitly. And standing at the altar beside them, wearing a custom-made leather collar and a very serious expression, was their best man. Titan had a few more silver hairs around his muzzle and a faded scar along his ribs, but his golden eyes were as sharp as ever. He was no longer a broken, unwanted bait dog left to die in an alleyway. He was the undisputed king of the Sullivan estate, a loyal guardian who slept at the foot of their bed every night, ensuring that the shadows never crept into their lives again. Sometimes the greatest protectors don't carry guns or wear badges. Sometimes they are simply the broken souls we choose to save who end up saving us in return. Years later, the Sullivan estate was no longer known for whispered threats and dark corridors, but for the laughter of children and the deep, reassuring rumble of a massive cane corso patrolling the lush gardens. Genevieve and Dominic built a legitimate, untouchable empire from the ashes of her father's dark legacy. Titan, the scarred bait dog no one wanted, lived out his final days not as a weapon of the underworld, but as a cherished family member. He became a living legend in Boston, the fiercely loyal, silent guardian who stepped into the crossfire and finally gave a voiceless girl her roar back. What an unbelievable story of survival. From a voiceless mafia princess to a powerful boss, all thanks to a broken street dog named Titan. If this jaw-dropping tale of loyalty and betrayal left you speechless, smash that like button and share this video. Subscribe and ring the notification bell to catch all our thrilling real-life drama stories. What would you have done? Comment your thoughts down below.